The giant Kinder Eggs of Doom, delivering not chocolatey joy and a plastic toy, which is illegal in the United States, but instead several to several dozen building-sized and very angry robots who may or may not be coming to pile drive you specifically into the next life, depending on how uppity you've been. The humble egg ship is BattleTech's vehicle of choice for moving everything from cargo to people to mechs and more, from orbit to the surface of a planet and back again. They're also the only way, for most of the setting's history at least, of moving any significant amount of stuff between the stars. Interstellar trade relies on these guys to function. And in this video, we'll be going over everything from their history, to how they function, to why they look like that. And also, this topic is a bit of an absolute monster that I did not expect diving into it, and was massively and happily surprised. I walked into this thinking, oh, it's gonna be a video with lots of egg jokes and some background on their development and stuff, only to stumble into an incredibly interesting tale of divergent evolution and competing designs that all fill different niches. Anyways, before we get into things, introductions. Generic greetings and welcome to Science Insanity, a channel dedicated to all things sci-fi, though mostly BattleTech. I'm Sai, professional idiot, turbo nerd, and your guide through this wonderful video. I hope you enjoy your stay and find it entertaining and informative. And with that, let's get into things, starting with history. Dropships in BattleTech are as iconic as the battlemechs themselves. It's almost impossible to go 10 steps without seeing the giant egg-shaped bulk landers or the flying brick single lance transports somewhere in the background. And that's because dropships are the method of getting tons of building-sized robots to and from wherever battlefield they're needed on. And while any cursory read over their history reveals a bunch of interesting stuff like why egg shape, or how they're designed to interface with jump ships for interstellar travel, the actual history and development of these things goes back to before battlemechs even existed, before any of the nation states we know and love from the setting were even ideas, and so far back they actually predate humanity expanding beyond the solar system. History in BattleTech diverged from reality in the late 20th century with the invention of stable fusion reactors occurring somewhere in the mid-2020s. While these early prototypes worked and began producing energy for general use, it would take another 80-odd years more for them to develop to the point where they could output enough energy to get rockets and ships into space. For much of BattleTech's history up until the turn of the century, 2100-ish, getting into orbit was done with chemical rockets, similar to what we have now. With the invention of more powerful fusion engines, classic rockets were phased out in favor of what would become known as drop shuttles. These were functionally the same, a giant rocket pushing a giant payload into orbit. The difference being that with the new fusion reactors, they wouldn't need anywhere near as much fuel and could make multiple trips to and from a planet. These early drop shuttles were also giant bricks, because they didn't need to worry about aerodynamics or the structural stability of big internalized pressurized fuel tanks. They were instead designed for maximum cargo carrying capacity and maximum integration into current-day logistics, which meant being a giant brick that you crammed a whole lot of cargo containers into. Around the same time, the Kearney-Fushida jump drive was being prototyped, and by the end of the 2110s, the first successful faster-than-light jump would be performed between two stable points within the solar system. Both of these advancements came about because of the glut of power that fusion engines could produce. The first ever extrasolar expedition would be launched to Tau Ceti later the same year, though there was a very rapid and very obvious problem that they discovered, which was they could do nothing once they got there, because they didn't really bring anything capable of going down to a planet and back up. As such, they had to adapt the current shuttles they were using and take them to the stars alongside. These early ships would often carry one to several drop shuttle bays, cavernous hangars where the drop shuttles would be anchored to ride along for the journey. Often they look like cassette tapes slotted into the ship. While these shuttle bays were able to carry ships massing up to 5,000 tons, that was functionally nothing compared to the resources required to set up a small community, much less any level of heavy industry or resource extraction. If you want a real-life comparison, these drop shuttles were about the same mass and size as SpaceX's Starship, though far squatter and blockier. And the reason that drop shuttles weren't enormous like the bulk landers and stuff back in the solar system that were starting to to churn off production lines was a consequence of how jump drives worked. They generate a field around the ship that, when collapsed, jumps the ship across dozens of light years in seconds. The issue was that this field was also extremely gravitationally unstable, and anything crossing that boundary that wasn't part of the main ship itself was liable to be ripped to shreds, mangled beyond recognition, or sliced apart like a laser had cut through it, all of which was random and unpredictable and might all happen to you at the same time. So any drop shuttles that they brought along with them had to be carried internally to avoid this. Hence why they, slotted in like a cassette tape. This is part of the reason why early expansion in BattleTech happened so slowly, with only a few planets explored and even fewer settled in the coming century. In order to get anything to another planet, you essentially had 500,000 tons worth of spaceship to move maybe a few thousand tons of material to and from another solar system, which, as I'm sure anybody who can do basic math will tell you, is massively inefficient. It's around now that you start seeing a bit of a divergence between warships and jump ships. Up until now, they were basically the same thing because only the military and central government could afford to use jump technology. But as it became more and more mature, we started to see jump-capable ships be designed similar to the Defender class, which is more transport than combat vessel, carrying multiple shuttle bays and expanded internal cargo holds for long-haul trips. And around now, the 2200s to 2300s, is when the first wave of mass expansion happened, sending people out to the far reaches of known space, settling everything from moons to barren rocks to prime terraforming candidates and more. And along the way, the humble drop shuttle was responsible for enabling it all. There were some other interesting examples around this time, such as the Mingo class cargo ship developed by Boeing, which was essentially a giant cylinder that clamped onto the front of a jump ship and off it went. But that one unfortunately required a specialized jump ship built from the ground up to dock with, and was hyper expensive and only marginally higher in carrying capacity than the average drop shuttle, so it never really took off on a large scale. The biggest shift in dropship technology came a few years after the invention of the first battlemech, the Mackie, and this would fundamentally overhaul not only cargo and military transport, but the fundamentals of how interstellar travel worked. And this invention was the Kearney-Fushida jump drive collar, or just the jump collar. This was a circular ring that was essentially a miniaturized piece of a jump drive, specifically the part that creates the jump field. Only instead of creating it, the collars would piggyback off the central drive and extend the field out around whatever the collar was part of in an ovoid shape. This would allow, theoretically, any sized ship to dock with and piggyback on another jump ship without the danger of being ripped apart or the need to carry an enormous jump drive itself. Just the collar. Overnight, the size limitations of what warships and jump ships could carry disappeared, and you could create a massive cargo vessel with a central jump collar and simply hitch a ride with a jump ship to wherever you needed to go. This was also the final divergence point between warships and jump ships. Going forwards, warships were heavily armed and armored and could carry external troop transports, but often didn't, while jump ships were essentially just a transport with a ton of docking rings for things to hitch a ride on. This is also the era where the dropship style we know and love, Big Egg, starts to come into its own. And this is also where the explanation for why Big Egg is Big Egg. These dropships were built from the ground up to incorporate a jump collar, usually being around the widest, most rotund part of the ship, and since the jump collars would create an ovoid-shaped extension of the carrier's jump field, the most space-efficient designs were often things that were just a big oval. There's also some generic hoo-ha about how the rounded surfaces make re-entry easier by dispersing heat, or how it's more resistant to incoming defensive fire if you're doing a combat landing, and yada 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 yada. Look, 90% of the reason is the jump collar. That's why egg-shaped, because that's how logistics work. And this development kicked off a massive boom in dropship designs. I should also mention shuttle versus ship, like what's the huge difference here when both of them need a carrier. Drop shuttles are vessels that can't act under their own power for long. They rely on a main carrier vessel to get to a planet, and then they just go up and down from that planet and dock in an internal hangar bay like a fighter craft. A drop ship ship is a whole-ass ship, capable of moving around for weeks at a time under its own power, landing on, getting off of, and moving between star systems, only needing a jump ship to get between solar systems. Now, you might be confused, because some of the most famous dropships in the setting are things like the Leopard. That doesn't look like Big Egg at all. What's going on here? Well, this is actually where some of the more interesting evolutions in BattleTech transports start happening, specifically because of copious amounts of violence. The militarization of the setting was going ham around this point. If the era's name, the Age of War, is anything to go by, it was quite a violent time, from around 2400 to 2550, right smack in the golden era of jump ship and dropship development. And this is where the two archetypes of dropship design would split off. Spherical, which we all know and love, the Egg Boys, the face of BattleTech transports, and the Aerodyne dropship, the brickly, bulky, bigly, almost aircraft-looking box side of dropship technology. While spherical dropships were all around great, they did have two huge weaknesses. Firstly, they're predictable. They're only really capable of vertical takeoff and landing, meaning once they lock into a landing or launch path, they don't really move or maneuver much. This makes them incredibly easy to shoot down, both by guided missiles and aerospace fighters, but also anti-orbital defense batteries that were starting to become commonplace around the territories that would become the Great Houses. And while sure, you could land on the opposite side of a planet to avoid their range of fire, that also made it really, really easy for the enemy to prepare their defenses, or give them time to call for backup, which is generally not a good thing. So into this problem entered the Aerodyne dropship. These are, on average, much smaller than spherical dropships, a lot of them only carrying a single lance of 4 mechs compared to the dozens that the bigger Eggy boys can bring. But because of their functional wings and more complex thruster layout, Aerodyne dropships were capable of maneuvering hard during a descent, and instead of landing near an enemy, could descend far off, and in the last leg of their journey, pretty well fly just above the ground and hot drop directly onto your target's face while avoiding most anti-orbital defenses. To reload its mechs and cargo and bring all that stuff back on board, the Aerodyne dropships needed about 20 minutes and a big flat stretch of ground to land on like an airplane, but the flexibility they brought with deployments and the fact that it was way harder to shoot them down meant they quickly became a prime pick for beachhead assaults, raids, and small behind-the-lines operations. A lot of Aerodyne dropships would also carry dedicated fighter backup to assist their landing, like how the Leopard, glorious brick of bricks, had 2 fighter bays built in to support whatever assault it was committed to. There was also a big difference between spherical and Aerodyne dropships when it comes to maintenance, storage, and safety. Because spherical dropships were pure VTOL, any damage to their engines or any significant impact could send them wildly off course and into an irrecoverable death spiral down to the planet below. Aerodyne dropships had a better, but still bad, chance of recovering into a controlled crash landing that personnel and mechs could walk away from. Spherical dropships are also insanely heavy, like they are very chunky boys, so softer ground is often straight up impossible to land on as they would sink into it or become unbalanced and unsafe to use. Meanwhile, the average Aerodyne dropship could just about land on a patch of dirt and taxi over to a nearby hangar. Essentially, Aerodyne ships need way less dedicated infrastructure or support and can make it in under the guns, so to say, during a lot of hostile landings. And before anyone brings anything up about the brickification of these ships, yes, the wings are actually functional on the overwhelming majority of Aerodynes. No, aerodynamics doesn't really matter, because if brute force isn't working, you're just not using enough of it. And boy, can these magical fusion engines supply enough of it. Also, we made helicopters fly, and fly is a very generous term for them, because helicopters more or less just punch the air into submission moving through anger. And if we can make that work, we could definitely make the Amazon package here fly. Another important distinction to be made between Aerodyne and spherical dropships is that spherical dropships are aligned with thrust gravity, meaning that all of their decks are laid out vertically, so as the ship is thrusting forward, it creates artificial gravity, and as it's going down to a planet, Down is also the direction of the planet's ground, so, lines up with gravity nicely. Aerodyne dropships are built like you see the overwhelming majority of science fiction ships built, like fake artificial gravity holding you down and you're at like a perpendicular angle to your direction of travel. Unfortunately, BattleTech doesn't have like fancy gravity plating or some of that stuff. There is some ridiculous versions of these dropships that have bottom thrusters that have them fly up in what I can only describe as the most hilarious mental image ever in order to simulate thrust gravity, but the overwhelming majority of them simply lock down all the mechs, lock down all the fighters, lock down all the personnel, and they have them basically bunk down in the command center or the crew quarters, and then they just deal with the lack of gravity or the shifted gravitational perspective as they move to a target and then eventually land on it. Not ideal, but again, these smaller ships aren't really meant for the comfort of their crew, they're meant to fill a specific niche in BattleTech's combat environment. This massive explosion of jump ship designs started to crystallize into a few different archetypes, and while several of these archetypes are listed out on the wiki, I disagree with many of them. Not from a they're wrong objectively standpoint, but more from a just like in real life, fictional ship classes are based entirely on vibes and vague blurry characteristics. The wiki lists the various dropship categories as assault, pocket warship, fighter carrier, cargo ship, mech carrier, troop transports, Q ships, and civilian transports. The Colossus is a massive dropship that carries 72 tanks in a dedicated bay, 36 mechs in a second bay, and 12 platoons of infantry in a third bay. The Colossus has one of the largest mixed-use transport bays in the setting, with a moderate weapons array that's more for self-defense than anything else. So, what class of ship do you think it is? Probably a troop transport, right? Because look at all of those troops. Maybe a mech carrier, since it does have like a massive complement of battle mechs. No, screw you. It's an assault ship. The definition of which reads, and I quote, typically used for anti-aerospace fighter and anti-dropship operations, they can be used for ground assault purposes, though this is rare. This type of dropship is also known to carry limited quantities of battlemechs, battle armor, marines, vehicles, and aerospace fighters, usually just enough to provide point-blank defense. So as you can see, something is wrong with these definitions, and this is exactly what happens in real-life navies, by the way. The most obvious example is how Japan does not have any aircraft carriers. They're helicopter-carrying destroyers, obviously. Please do not look any more into this than what we've called it. I assure you, the name is 100% accurate. The nomenclature and naming is significantly less important than the stats and the combat role, in my opinion. Plus, sometimes, just like in real life, nations will just label things wrong on purpose for a variety of reasons. So I am replacing all of that stuff on the wiki with similar but tweaked definitions because I feel like my version is slightly less nonsensical. Though feel free to argue about this in the comments below. Those altered classes being civilian transports, light transports, heavy transports, assault ships, land and orbital subclasses, pocket warships, carriers, and utility dropships. Civilian transports are obvious. They're all the dropships used for economic or civilian purposes. They often don't have any significant amount of armor or weapons, sometimes being entirely unarmed. Their vessels are of purely economic function. The first example would be the Behemoth, one of the biggest non-warship vessels in the setting. A 280-meter tall monster of a cargo vessel that has an engine wider than the entirety of the Union-class dropship and a cargo capacity of 75,000 tons. Which may not sound like a lot when ocean goers in real life, the biggins that move through the Suez Canal, hit around 200,000 deadweight tons, but remember, the Behemoth flies. Second example, the Monarch, a luxury people carrier meant for short to medium haul flights between worlds. In airliner configuration, it could carry a few thousand people for short under-a-day flights between local planets and their moons. Or, when configured in the default long-haul luxury format, you bring around 300 people and 270 staterooms, complete with ensuite bathroom, wine cooler, holovid player, and more. While on the lower of the 4 decks the ship possesses, it also had shops, casinos, restaurants, casinos, dining rooms, and casinos. Did I mention gambling? Please go gambling on your trip. Next up, light transports. These are military vessels, sometimes refit, and refit ships are what Q ships technically are from the old categories, and sometimes purpose-built ships to carry troops into battle. They're moderately armed and moderately armored while being faster and more versatile than their larger-to-come siblings. I really don't think it's necessary to have entire classes of dropships specifically for infantry or tanks, since it's pretty common to see mixed use. I'd go so far as to say most dropships are mixed use. So the troop carrier and mech carrier and all of that just gets smushed into one category. Light transports. These range, in my opinion, from the smaller side of the Leopard or the Seleucus class, carrying a lance of mechs and a mix of tanks and battle armor respectively, to the larger end of light transports like the Union and Lion class, carrying 12 battlemechs and 8 battlemechs, 12 tanks respectively. These are also the kinds of transports you'd see run by mercenary units, pirates, or supplementary forces, with enough capacity to get units onto the battlefield, but not enough to deliver entire armies or regimental combat teams or something. They're also a lot cheaper and way more flexible than what comes next. Because they're smaller and lighter and cheaper, light transports can land pretty much anywhere that's flat, while heavy transports and some assault ships would sink into or become dangerously unbalanced on that softer or less flat terrain. And speaking of, heavy transports are up next. They are obviously quite similar, but instead of smaller units, they're meant to carry the backbone of an invasion. And a few heavy transports can deliver a potentially world-conquering force of mechs, tanks, and men. The aforementioned Colossus would fit here, since while it's still moderately armored and armed for its size, it carries an enormous amount of troops. Other examples would be ships like the Conquistador, which carried 24 battlemechs, 12 100-ton tanks, and 18 aerospace fighters, and could also carry additional infantry if you swapped out the cargo bay. Or if you're looking for the less glorious ground-pounding variety, the Seeker is your dropship of choice, which carried 40 tanks and 4 platoons of mechanized infantry by default, though it was incredibly common to see them refit to carry 4 additional battlemechs and some aerospace fighters at the cost of a few tanks. Overall though, heavy transports do the same thing as light transports, bringing dudes to the surface for foitin', but they carry 3 to 5 times more units per ship, and a few of them can easily vomit out over 100 battlemechs, with hundreds of tanks and infantry platoons and aerospace assets all of once. You get like a dozen of these things together and you've basically got a planet-conquering force. The downside is that these types of heavy transports, unlike the light version, are often heavily constrained by terrain. You can't land them anywhere with soft, uneven, or rough ground. They just can't handle that. The really big ones might even need dedicated landing pads, requiring you to capture the local spaceport before they can safely come down. Next up is assault ships. To put it most simply, these are giant gunboats designed to clear their landing zone and make sure enemies stay well back, and they come in 2 subgroups: ground and space assault. Contrary to the original definition, ground assault is actually one of their main functions. You might look at the armaments on light or heavy transports and sweat a little bit in your mech seat at the firepower arrayed against you, but those are nothing compared to assault ships. They often only carry a few units. 3 to 4 lances of mechs is pretty luxurious for an assault ship, but they have an absurd amount of armor and guns to make up for it. These are things like the Fortress, massing double the firepower of the Colossus while being half the size, while being similarly armored, and bringing a long tom on top just in case anyone was slightly too far away to punch in the teeth with your normal weapons loadout. The Fortress smacks down onto a battlefield and says quite confidently, "Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough." Or ships like the Polaris, a truly stupid ship built by Clan Ghostbear to be the bigliest big that ever bigged. It has 20 heavy vehicle bays and 10 battle armor bays, which is not a huge amount of firepower, but it uses them to secure the surrounding landing area before bringing its eye-watering 4 UAC-20s, 14 Gauss rifles, 5 ER large lasers, 40 large pulse lasers to bear against anyone stupid enough to try and attack it, and if you run away, it also has 4 cruise missile launchers that it can fire 50 standard game sheets away. Since each standard game sheet is like 22 inches long, this thing's maximum range is 1100 inches or 29 meters. You could be in your garage win a match, and as your buddy is quote-unquote retreating at the end of the day with his mechs back to his house, you can keep fucking shooting him all the way across the street and into his garage. This thing is stupid. I love it. But assault dropships have a subgroup, and these ones are in space. Not every one is capable of landing on a planet. Orbital assault ships are dropships designed to fight in space, carrying weapons and troop loads specifically designed for dealing with other dropships and small craft, like the Isegrim, which is just an orc fight-a-bomber pre-orc hijacking. Change my mind. It only carries a few aerospace fighters and a blistering array of anti-dropship and fighter weapons, including manta ray anti-ship missiles, a dozen hyper-assault Gauss 40s, and an assortment of large lasers and particle cannons all across it to swat incoming fighters out of the void. Assault dropships in general are the vanguard, punching a hole through enemy defenses in orbit and landing on the ground so other dropships can land unmolested. And next up, pocket warships. You would think that with how heavily armed a lot of assault ships are, there would be kind of a blurring of the lines here, but not really. Pocket warships are dropships that have been up-armored and up-gunned to a frankly absurd level. Sometimes they're purpose-built, sometimes they're converted by necessity. A purpose-built pocket warship would be things like the Taiho, a dropship with a few bays of boarding infantry and battle armor because it would be really funny to recreate that Genndy Tartakovsky Star Wars animation. And it also has a massive array of heavy weapons, including 4 naval autocannon 10 equivalent guns mounted to the front, along with an absurd number of very heavy-hitting support weapons all across it. Another example would be the Neko Honoo, which, God, I hope I said that right, which looks to have at least one of every weapon in the setting. Holy shit, that weapons list. Along with 3 Kraken missile launchers taking up most of the ship's internals. The Kraken is an anti-warship missile capable of doing crippling damage to smaller ships like destroyers if it hits, and being a credible threat to bigger ones. Pocket warships are best thought of as glass cannons that are up into naval warfare levels rather than being down with other dropships and small ships. They often have a lot of firepower in them and are built to serve in the line of battle during warship engagements, but they will not survive being the direct target of another proper warship. Though they are, when punching down, a borderline insurmountable threat for other dropships and small craft. Like, a single pass from a Taiho would probably split a Union open like an egg. I also added carriers in here as their own distinct class, but that's a bit of a formality. The biggest reason they get their own category is because they can also like hang out in orbit and spam bombing runs against ground targets and stuff and be that annoying air support without needing to be part of a naval task group. But I don't like them. Looks inside my mech game. Sees planes. No thanks, I've had enough with War Thunder ground forces. And lastly, utility dropships. These are dropships designed for non-combat or utility purposes but aren't civilian or economic vessels. These are things like the Howdah, a drone tender that operated alongside SLDF space defense systems and maintained and supported those drone warships. Or the Hoshiryoko. This was a dropship refit that turned it into a tugboat, meant to maneuver giant ships around in orbit or even recover ships that are out of fuel and tug them back to safety before gravity captures them and pulls them down to a planet or something. And of course, the Octopus, because I see that you were damaged during an engagement, Mr. Warship. Allow me to touch you all up everywhere and fix that for you. It's a repair, rescue, and salvage dropship that can conduct some critical repairs to get other ships back underway, and it's got a bunch of touchy-feely grabby arms and I hate it. Thank you. Little addendum here before we get to the last segment of honorable mentions and cool little-known dropships. I wanted to talk a bit more about technical parts of these things and some of the designs and some other random factoids that I couldn't really fit in. There's pretty much no information on the overwhelming majority of dropships, but they're all the same in principle. Dropships have several core systems that make them up. The most important of these being the engine deck or engineering room, main engines, the mech bays, crew accommodations, and command infrastructure. The layout is vastly different between spherical and Aerodyne ships, but if you want to think about things like this, Aerodyne dropships are just the big eggy boys, but, rotated 90 degrees. Simple. And starting with the Aerodynes, they're made up usually of 2 main decks. Sometimes they have more, but it's rare and generally only seen on the bigger passenger liners over combat ships. The main deck for Aerodynes is where all the mechs, equipment, ammo, fuel, and well, all of the stuff that makes the ship work, as well as all the stuff that the ship is trying to move, go. At the back is the engine room, a large compartment that houses the main reactor, as well as access to the internals of the main engines. Some Aerodyne dropships have additional thrusters along the bottom and front of the ship to assist in landings or to allow the ship to hover in atmosphere. If the ship has those, then the engineering room also has access to a bunch of Jeffries tubes, for lack of a better example, that go beneath the main deck and allow techs to access and maintain them. This is also super complicated though, so a lot of lower tech factions, especially in the periphery, just use normal chemical rockets that need to be refueled every couple missions. Taking up the bulk of the main deck is the mech or unit bays. Sometimes each bay is separated by bulkheads to stop fires or explosions or external fire from spreading. Sometimes it's entirely open to allow mech techs more room and equipment to work. A happy middle ground would be the broadsword, which has 2 main mech bays, each containing 2 mechs with a 5th separate one in the nose. And down the center of the ship is a armored hallway. The front of most Aerodynes is where you'll find stuff like the crew quarters and amenities. Chow hall, bunks, storage rooms, mostly because this is the only area that there's room to keep them. Though because of their small size and the one and done mission role, these are often super bare bones and simple. The med bay, if some of the smaller Aerodynes even have one, is mostly just trauma kits and enough supplies to stabilize the wounded till they can be transferred to a proper facility. The second deck on Aerodynes is reserved for the command center, meeting rooms, and some more luxurious rooms for officers. Since space is limited, once again, the cockpit doubles as the command center, where pilots, gunners, and the commander/captain all sit during deployments. This is also where all the comms equipment stuff routes to. Back from that, there are meeting rooms and officer accommodations, though I can't imagine how comfortable they are with mechs rattling around beneath your feet and thrusters going off over your head, but I mean, hey, at least you get a bed instead of hot bunking with the rest of the crew. Aerodyne dropships also have a mostly unique way of offloading their mechs. Beneath each mech bay is a drop chute, essentially a door that swings open to allow the mechs to drop out the bottom into combat. Optionally with some kind of support lines, parachutes, single-use rockets, or other to assist in the drop. Again though, optional. This is not often used though, because unlike what you see in games and animations and stuff, especially MechWarrior 5, most mechs do not appreciate being dropped several stories onto the ground, and many pilots are not skilled enough to make the landing and fall over as soon as they touch down, or just whiff entirely and eat shit. This is generally only for jump jet equipped mechs, lighter mechs, or for when things are getting desperate and the pilot doesn't think they'll have time for a proper landing, because the enemy has a rather kinetic opinion on that landing. Unless you're a Novacat, which, you know, they do their whole jump jet mid-air drop thing, which, you know, okay, fine. They got absolutely ass blasted by aerospace assets trying that, but to each their own. Drop chutes can also be found on the occasional spherical dropship as well, but for reasons I will get into, I consider that very, very dumb and silly. The far more likely method for Aerodyne dropships to deploy their troops was by landing and deploying dedicated ramps. Sometimes the various bays have to slide the armor out of the way, sometimes the outer armor doubles as the boarding ramp and just flips down for mechs, tanks, and battle armor to walk off. These ramps are also how anything gets back in, including recovery vehicles with destroyed mechs or salvage. Also, I will die on this hill, while it is to the best of my knowledge impossible in all the rules and examples to do this, I believe it is theoretically possible for a mech with jump jets to match vectors and jump back into the open drop chute or bay door of a dropship mid-hover or flight. I am offering a 1 million C-bill bounty on this for any stupid, enterprising mech jock that succeeds at pulling this off. Please ensure you record the entire thing. And moving on to spherical dropships, they're pretty similar to Aerodynes, but instead of being laid out horizontally, they're laid out vertically with a hell of a lot more space. The very lowest deck of every spherical dropship is the engineering deck. This is where the main reactor is alongside the main engines, power transfer systems, and life support systems in the vein of atmosphere scrubbers and water treatment. The engineering deck also has internal access to all of those systems for maintenance, as well as the interior side of the landing struts. Most dropships, at least the spherical ones, have those big deployable feet that function as both the landing gear and secondary engines for landing and takeoff. Though any serious maintenance work on the engines has to be when the ship is landed or the crew needs to be spacewalking, since the engines are on the other side of the pressurized hull. On the opposite end, the very highest deck is normally the ship's bridge, where similar to Aerodyne dropships, the entire command staff resides. Though unlike Aerodyne dropships, the extra room on the spherical ones allows for way more officers and specialized roles and some separate compartments specifically for them. While most of a dropship's operations are automated by the ship's computer, it's vital to have competent human backups in case any number of things go wrong. As such, a ship might have several docking and flight control personnel in a little wing to manage the launching and recovering of aerospace fighters. They might have multiple gunnery teams, each responsible for a different arc of the ship's defense in another area. They might have comms officers to manage ground forces in the local AO, and more depending on what the dropship has been designed to do or how it's been refit to meet the needs of its owners. The command deck / bridge is also able to entirely separate itself from the rest of the ship. Not like flying away Star Trek style, like separating the saucer section, but instead they can lock everything down, keeping control of life support power and security systems exclusively in the command deck, while they can vent the rest of the ship. You know, in case they're ever boarded. Or there's a mutiny. The middle 2/3 of the ship is where everything else goes on. Usually directly below the bridge is the crew quarters and amenities, since the wider sections are needed for heavier stuff like battlemech or fighter storage. The actual crew berths ring the outside of the ship alongside secondary manual traversal like stairs or ladders that go up and down between the decks, while the center of the deck has the elevators, chow hall, med bay, and all the various amenities that the crew can enjoy. Depending on the size of the ship, these can also be pretty impressive. An actual kitchen with prepared meals compared to the MREs that Aerodyne crews get, a fully functioning med bay with trauma center and staffed with med techs, sometimes even luxuries like a small movie room, gym, or library are included to keep the crew entertained, as dropships can spend days to weeks traveling between a port of call or combat landing. Of course, none of these will ever match a dedicated facility on the ground, but many spherical dropships are the first and only resort for medical care and utilities during an operation. Below that are the mech storage and repair bays. The exact layout varies from ship to ship, with the Union, for example, having 2 mixed-use decks, while others like the Colossus have dedicated storage areas and elevators that go up and down between them. But going off the more standard mixed use, the central decks of spherical dropships house things like ammo and spare parts storage, dedicated repair bays, and mech lifts to move things up and down. Just like the crew quarters, the mech bays ring the outer edge of the deck with lifts in the center, and smaller elevators for mech techs to move ammo down should returning ground forces need a quick rearm. The ship's main deck is similar but slightly different. Instead of having a bit of everything, it's usually reserved for mission-ready mechs and vehicles only. The reason for this is the boarding ramps. Since the main deck is where you get on and off the boat, it's generally a really bad idea to have mechs in repair or big storage bays here, because what you really want is all of your mission-ready units to be up and out the door as fast as possible once you touch down, not waiting one by one to take the mech lifts down from higher decks. You'll often find at least 1 or 2 full mech bays here with repair and rearm facilities though, because sometimes units will return to the ship mid-mission after they've expended all of their ammo, cough cough riflemen, or have taken critical damage, cough cough Shadowhawk. All across the ship, there are also multiple weapons bays. These are separated by armored bulkheads from the rest of the ship to stop the risk of sympathetic detonations, and each of them have their own internal ammo supplies. Aerospace fighters also get separate armored bays for a similar reason, and are usually never on the main deck and are somewhere up higher where they can put them out of the way. Since they're deployed in space and atmosphere, they need to be kept separate, since they also need an airlock that can depressurize and that they can return into. Though dropships with larger aerospace complements might have Battlestar Galactica-style launch tubes where they load fighters and then launch them while keeping a massive central flight deck pressurized for ease of work. Looping back to that earlier statement on very silly dropshoots, spherical dropships do have them, but I find them very, very stupid, because the overwhelming majority of the time it is useless or unusable. The Union has 4 drop chutes. Supposedly, this is to allow one of its 3 lances to deploy faster, but it makes no sense. Not only would they have to fall through the engineering deck and engine assembly, but where do you use this? Upper atmosphere would be a really funny way to kill someone you don't like, because good luck surviving that fall, even with jump jets. And closer to the ground is also silly, because you're in the danger zone of the engine plume or just being crushed as the dropship is about to land. So like, How? My best guess is that every time you see drop shoots on spherical dropships, they're actually drop pods, not the simple hole you drop a mech out of on something like a Leopard. Drop pods are essentially a giant single-use rocket booster / armored shell that holds a mech inside, survives re-entry, and then decelerates to safe speeds before landing on the ground. And it would make a lot more sense for every example of quote-unquote drop shoots on spherical dropships to be these, rather than just a window that you chuck an Atlas out of and hope he lands fine on his own. You know what I mean? And with that, this little addendum is over. Back to our scheduled programming. Anyways, dropships come in many forms and purposes, built by everyone from the clans to the Word of Blake to the Terran hegemony pre-Star League, and to end it all off, I want to go over some lesser-known dropship types that I find really cool, and I encourage you to go look them up as well. Everybody knows about the Overlord, but there are over 100 unique classes of dropships out there. The Manatee was the first ever dropship to be used for mech transport, converted from a cargo hauler. The Seleucus is kick-ass. Lots of long-range artillery to clear landing zones for infantry and battle armor load. Also, it looks kick-ass. Look at this thing, it's amazing. The Vampire, drop infantry ship, deploys paratroopers at the outer edge of a planet's atmosphere for surprise deep strikes on top of anti-orbital weapons and stuff. Dopey, but very cool, and has often had a crazy element of surprise to it. The Tretzberg, kinda shit at deploying any forces groundside, so kind of a mediocre assault craft, but it does have 3 long toms on it, so you can deploy disgusting amounts of fuck you wherever you need it to be. And to the person who hoped I would talk about more than just like the 4 well-known dropships, I hope this satisfies you. There's a lot of really cool ones out there. Once I started getting into this, I rapidly fell in love with all the designs out there and then got really angry that we only ever see like 4. And that brings us to the end of the video. If you made it this far, you're clearly the target audience, or you just enjoyed your stay, so why not leave a like, comment down below, ring the bell, do all the stuff that boosts engagement with the algorithm, because it really does help. If you're feeling more generous, consider joining the channel members. You get access to videos a day or 2 early, occasionally get to vote on future videos, occasionally get cut content and behind the scenes videos, and it would make me very happy. And if not, if you just want to hang out, we do have a Discord with a small community of fellow turbo nerds that hang out, argue about nerd stuff, and occasionally do game nights and stuff. I also stream on Twitch. To all the people already supporting the channel, a huge thanks to the coffee vendors, fueling my war on sleep. The amount of caffeine throwing through my veins has turned my blood to syrup. Huge thanks to the food merchants, without whom starvation would have claimed me long ago. I am enjoying a burrito bowl after this, courtesy of you guys. And to the arms dealers, the guys going above and beyond to support the channel, supplying all the tools and toys seen in today's video, a huge special thanks to you guys as well. Because of your support, I have placed 2 jumbos and an assault triumph orbiting Earth in glorious formation. Anyone across the globe may look up and behold majesty because of your commitment. Thank you very much. And with that, video's over. I have nothing else to say. See you next time.